month after Pearl Harbor, a cable was delivered to Winston Churchill. All that was visible on the outside were the words immediate and most secret. And not without good reason. The letters are scathing criticism of Churchill, essentially saying, "I told you so," about the fall of Malaya.
Malaya has fallen to the Japanese. British forces have retreated to Singapore as Prime Minister Churchill is forced to turn his attention away from Germany.
The writer then goes on to say that he will offer no apologies for the failure of Britain's empire in the Pacific, before signing off as John Curtin, Prime Minister of Australia. No Australian leader had ever spoken to Britain like this, let alone Churchill. But what Curtin didn't even know was that Churchill had already agreed to sacrifice Australia to the Japanese by persuading America into a Europe First strategy. Perhaps what's most incredible was that in our darkest hour, Curtin's direct political opponent Arthur Fadden would label him as Australia's greatest ever Prime Minister. This is the man who defied Churchill and came out victorious.
And the complete ordering of all the resources, human and material.
So, at the end of 1942, Curtin stood in front of the camera in Canberra for his New Year's message. The tagline was simple: make selflessness the guiding factor in everything that comes to pass. But Curtin's road to being the wartime leader was anything but smooth. So John Curtin grew up in a family of exiles. His father was once a policeman but suffered serious cognitive decline after contracting syphilis. When he inappropriately touched a woman, he was forced to retire and leave the Victorian town of Creswick. The other particularly interesting thing about Curtin was that he was raised a Catholic. Actually, that in itself wasn't interesting at all. His parents were Irish. But at one point, Curtin considered becoming a priest. That was until he lost his faith in his teens and instead decided to direct his religious impulse towards the Socialist Party.
The Socialist Party gathers outside before their communion. I can confirm that the communion wine will be red wine, if you know what I mean.
Okay, so this right here was the Australian Socialist Party. Now, what made them a unique party was that they kind of knew that they were never going to get many seats in office, and they also knew that the Labor Party was their best shot at implementing their agenda. So instead of focusing on gaining political office, they instead focused on raising disciples for the Labor Party. And no, I'm not exaggerating the use of the word disciple. They not only had a weekly newspaper, but also had Sunday school and even hymns. It was church, but replaced God as the object of worship with a political ideology.
Though cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here.
Now, Curtin became heavily involved with the Socialist Party, and this was where he found a home. If you look at a photo of Curtin, you'd probably notice this: a muscular distortion in his eye. As a teenager, this dented his confidence, but the Socialist Party helped hone his debating skills, which then increased his confidence. However, once again, Curtin faced a setback. At just 16, his friend Nancy suddenly died of pneumonia. A distraught Curtin turned to the bottle to cope. Alcoholism would then plague him for nearly 3 decades. But as 1942 ends, a now sober Curtin is faced with a new burden. At his say-so, thousands of Australians had died stopping the Japanese in New Guinea after Churchill let them take Malaya and Singapore. But Curtin's grievances with Churchill dated back to 1915. When the Great War fell upon Europe, Curtin was a rare dissenting voice against the war, particularly resenting Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, for sending imperial forces through the Dardanelles to open a supply route to Russia. In fact, Curtin so bitterly opposed the war that he ran for the seat of Balaclava in Victoria. He lost. You're about to see that this will become a reoccurring theme. At the end of the war, Curtin left Victoria for WA and became the editor of the Western Australian Worker. But in 1919, Curtin would once again run for office, this time in the seat of Perth. And he lost again. You probably saw that one coming. However, after this defeat, Curtin fell into a depression. In fact, he actually routinely described dark clouds looming over his state of mind. Perhaps this actually equipped him for the burdens of wartime leadership. Now, by this point, Curtin had a profile. He was known as the eloquent socialist within the Labor Party who couldn't get a seat. And so when the League of Nations formed the International Labour Organisation to set the minimum working standards, Australia chose Curtin to be its 1924 representative in Geneva. While there, Curtin became convinced that pragmatism was the way forward and change could only be achieved in increments. Eager to be a little more politically astute, Curtin returned home to contest the seat of Fremantle in 1925, and he lost again. But that wouldn't last for long, as in 1925 he then won the seat of Fremantle, triumphantly gaining office, before he lost it again in 1931. But having been in office for 3 years, Curtin had impressed his own party. In fact, Labour's health minister, Frank Anstey, even urged Curtin to take his safe seat. Curtin's reply was mint. "I have my days of dark clouds, but we were standard bearers in a holy war and not yield while life is left to us." Just as a side note, could you imagine ScoMo or someone having resolve like that today? So declining the easy route back into office, Curtin then won Fremantle back in 1934.
To suggest that investments will not be sound in this country because Australia is being governed by a Labour government. Let me assure the people of Great Britain that this government of ours will do nothing to destroy the great credit of Australia.
So Prime Minister James Scullins' response to the Great Depression caused two factions to break off from Labour. The first was Jack Lang's faction for not going far enough, but the second was Joseph Lyons' faction for being too radical. Lyons merged with the opposition and took 6 Labour members with him, taking government away from Labour in 1932 and forming the United Australia Party. Bereft of leadership options, Scullin remained Labour leader up until his resignation in 1935, and Labour decided to give Curtin a go.
The war which Japan started can now only end in the complete defeat of Japan.
The 1935 Labour Party spill was wild. The two final candidates were, of course, Curtin, but then another guy called Frank Ford. The vote went 10 votes for Ford and then 11 for Curtin, but with one condition. Curtin had to stay off the drink. He agreed. But this only gave Curtin the title of opposition leader. Lyons' United Australia Party still needed to be defeated. Now, for obvious reasons, Europe became, let's just say, a tense place by the end of the 1930s. What was really striking was that Curtin constantly warned that Australia needed to defend Australia before the British Empire. In other words, Australia's greatest threat wasn't Germany, but Japan. That being said, when new Prime Minister Robert Menzies gave this broadcast,
"Fellow Australians, it is my melancholy duty to inform you officially that in consequence of a persistence by Germany in her invasion of Poland, Great Britain has declared war upon her, and that as a result, Australia is also at war."
Curtin completely agreed that Hitler had to be stopped. Like I said before, it was the United Australia Party who were in power in the 1930s, and Menzies would lead the nation for the first 2 years of the war. Like Churchill, Menzies floated the idea of abolishing political parties for the duration of the war, but Curtin vehemently opposed this idea. However, in the 1940 elections, the UAP lost their majority and relied on the support of 2 independents to form government. While this in of itself was a great win for Labour, the result was a disaster for Curtin personally. It was just about confirmed that he'd lost his seat in Fremantle, and his resignation letter was already written. That was until the count showed that Curtin had actually won by 1,000 votes. It's crazy to think about. If 500 people voted differently, then the Australian home front would have been completely different. Now, even though Curtin had refused Menzies' idea of no political parties, he gave his complete support of Menzies' leadership. The main point of tension between the two was that Curtin thought Menzies was too soft on Britain and needed to press them harder to ensure Singapore was secure enough to stop a Japanese advance southward. Now, this isn't a Menzies video, so I won't go into too much detail on him, though you can listen to our podcast for the full World War II breakdown. And so obviously when Menzies comes back for round 2 in the 50s, like if you're Labour, you've just got to bring that up over and over and over again. Hey, what'd you say, 1939 again? But Menzies' main issue was that Churchill convinced him to deploy Australian forces to defend Greece against the Germans, and this failed badly. When Menzies returned from his meeting with Churchill, his own party called a vote of no confidence against him. Interestingly, this decision was neither supported by Curtin or the 2 independents, Arthur Coles and Alex Wilson. For knifing their own in a time of war, Coles and Wilson defected to Labour, letting Curtin form government, and this was just in time.
Men and women of Australia, we are at war with Japan.
So Curtin became the Prime Minister on October 7, exactly 2 months before Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. As news broke of this so-called shock attack, Curtin was asleep in Melbourne. When he was woken, he simply said, "Well, it has come." Curtin was hardly surprised by this, but was left incredibly frustrated that Churchill had long dismissed Australia's concerns of Japan and the Pacific. Bereft of Australian divisions capable of defending Australia, his only option was to trust that Singapore would hold out. He didn't hold much hope and made his anger at Britain very clear. In World War I and with Nazi Germany, Australia didn't so much declare war, but rather said by being at war with Britain, they were by consequence at war with Australia. With Japan, Curtin outright declared war. In the weeks afterwards, Curtin felt only token reinforcements had been sent to defend Singapore, and that the Prince of Wales and Repulse were vulnerable to a Japanese attack. No longer could Australia simply trust that Britain would defend them. Instead, they needed their own contingency plan. 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, Curtin raised the middle finger to Churchill, saying, "Without any inhibitions of any kind, I make it quite clear that Australia looks to America, free of any pangs as to our traditional links or kinship with the United Kingdom." Curtin then went harder, sending that cable that we saw in the beginning, before sending this one saying evacuating Singapore to defend Burma would be an inexcusable portrayal of Australia.
What the Sigmas? Singapore has fallen to the Japanese. Churchill was wrong. Singapore is not impenetrable.
Like Malaya, Singapore was completely inadequately fortified, and in February of 1942, it fell to the Japanese. What was perhaps worse was that Britain actually blamed the defeat on Aussie cowardice, despite the Australian 8th Division suffering 73% of the Allied casualties, but only making up 13% of the Allied forces. With Curtin now receiving confirmation that Britain was leaving them to fend for themselves, his words were chilling. The battle for Australia is beginning. Only the poorly defended Dutch East Indies stood between Japan and Australia. But as Curtin was preparing for war, his health took a turn for the worse. His years of heavy alcohol consumption had forced him to be hospitalised with gastritis, and while Curtin was down, Japan struck.
First pictures from Darwin show that the northern outpost of the Aussies has taken quite a beating from Jap bombs. But despite everything, they're carrying on with that fighting spirit that typifies everyone in Australia.
Having taken Singapore, Japanese pilots gave Australia the Pearl Harbor treatment, bombing the military town of Darwin. 236 were killed, though Curtin tried to hide the extent of the damage. However, those living in Darwin were scarred, with half the town permanently leaving. The message was clear: we're coming. So Curtin had to act immediately. World War II was no longer a distant concept of fighting the Nazis abroad, but instead now stopping an invasion. Now, Curtin could afford to withdraw 2 divisions who were fighting Rommel in North Africa. However, if those divisions were going to the Pacific, Churchill wanted them over here instead, in Burma. This was to protect India, the crown jewel of the empire. Churchill made his request to Curtin, but Curtin was so insulted that he left Churchill unread. And no, I'm not making this up. Churchill interpreted this as no news is good news, and so made the executive decision to restation the Australian soldiers to Burma instead of defending their homeland. Of course, when Curtin found out, he was furious and overruled Churchill. However, he did make a compromise, allowing them to stop in Sri Lanka on the way home as a temporary deterrent to Japan. But Curtin didn't just call home the 2 divisions, he also recalled Australia's highest profile general, Thomas Blamey. But Blamey was overshadowed by someone else arriving.
Tumultuously enthusiastic crowds in Manila greet General of the Army Douglas MacArthur and his wife.
Douglas MacArthur was in town. Now, to say MacArthur had an ego is a bit of an understatement. For instance, when America reclaimed the Philippines in 1944, MacArthur drafted a press release saying, "I have returned." When his advisors said, "Hey, this is kind of a team effort here, maybe use the word we instead of I," MacArthur refused. But the reality was that a cult of personality was built around his generalship, so much so that Roosevelt, the commander-in-chief, was hesitant to overrule him for fear of public backlash. Having lost the Philippines and with the Brits losing Singapore, Australia made the most sense for America to set up shop and prepare a counterattack. In other words, it was in America's direct interest not to have Australia fall to Japan. So, in practical terms, the strategic decision-making around preventing an invasion was now taken out of Curtin's hands and was placed in America's. MacArthur famously said to Curtin, "You take care of the rear, I'll handle the front." Emboldened, Curtin cried out to the public, "We'll trade punches with the Japanese until we rock the enemy on his heels." And so by the middle of 1942, Japan's momentum was completely halted. In the Battle of the Coral Sea, Japan failed to secure Port Moresby and for the first time had their advance stopped. Then a month later, Japan lost 4 of its 6 heavy carriers in the Battle of Midway. And while that was happening at sea, the Battle of Guadalcanal saw America reclaim the Solomon Islands, and Australia's 39th Battalion famously fended off the advancing Japanese along the Kokoda Track. However, it was at Kokoda where Curtin first experienced the fact that America certainly didn't view them as equals. Having pushed the Japanese all the way to the northern town of Buna, MacArthur instead ordered American soldiers to come in and finish off the job. This was almost certainly so that New Guinea would go down as an American rather than as an Australian win. However, America suffered a 90% casualty rate and couldn't finish Japan off, so MacArthur reluctantly recalled Australian soldiers to take Boona and Gona. It was an embarrassment for MacArthur, but showed Curtin what could happen if he just ran straight into America's arms. That being said, by 1943, any threat of Japanese invasion was over, and now they were on the retreat. Curtin's task at hand was maintaining the war effort at home until the enemy surrendered.
The freedom and safety of Australia was subjected to dire peril. The whole defence capacity of the country had to be transformed.
Now, there was a slight issue. Conscription was a thing, but only in Australian territory. Now, Papua New Guinea was under the control of Australia, but as Japan was pushed back, they crossed into Dutch New Guinea, meaning by law, the conscript forces had to stop. At a Labour conference, Curtin actually proposed expanding conscription. This was particularly surprising because he so vehemently opposed Billy Hughes trying to introduce conscription for the Western Front in World War I. The rest of Labour wasn't so convinced, and so they had to compromise for just a restricted expansion. But how's this for narrative? You know how I just said Curtin opposed Billy Hughes in World War I? Well, after Menzies had to resign, the UAP was so bereft of leadership options that 25 years later, they brought him back. That'd be like America bringing back George W. Bush. Now, for the opposition, usually the UAP was the senior partner, while its ally, the Country Party, was the junior partner. This was because they brought less seats to the table. However, Hughes was such an uninspiring candidate that they instead opted for Arthur Fadden of the Country Party to lead the opposition to Curtin. In 1943, Curtin convincingly won 49-23, making him no longer dependent on those independents, and Menzies was returned as the opposition leader. At the same time, the economy was booming. Curtin's promise to guarantee that the government purchased anything produced by farmers led to a massive increase in grain output since 1941. Munitions factories increased from 2 in 1939 to 32 in 1943, and Curtin got the states to drop their levying power. Now, only the federal government collected income tax. With the momentum of the boom, Curtin put out a referendum asking for greater power over the economy when Australia returned to peacetime. The Australian public voted no. We're pretty good at that. Now, as the war came to a close, Curtin became increasingly concerned about American imperialism. In 1944, Curtin signed the Anzac Agreement with New Zealand, vowing to limit the spread of American influence to north of the equator. Not only that, but Curtin tried to somewhat patch things up with Britain, making King George's brother the Governor-General rather than an Australian. But as the real post-war negotiations began, Curtin wouldn't be present. In October of 1944, he suffered a stroke and then a heart attack the next month. He resumed his duties again in January before being hospitalised again with congested lungs in April. In July, just 1 month before the end of the war, Curtin breathed his last. His official cause of death was listed as war weariness, overexertion, stress, and heart disease. Under his tenure, Australia fended off invasion, mobilised an entire economy towards war, kept far more social cohesion than in World War I, and left the nation unburdened by war debt. And for that, Fadden himself called him Australia's greatest ever Prime Minister. But I wonder who you'd have as your top. John Howard? Gough Whitlam? Absolutely no idea. We can actually bring you up to speed on every Aussie Prime Minister. Start here with the GOAT, Edmund Barton.